Virtually every leader in the health freedom movement talks about the insecurity of the food supply as one of the primary avenues of tyranny. Our family has rigorously sourced our foods for over a decade, and one of our favorite sources is Farm Match. And specifically, if you are in San Diego, Real Food Club PMA. My kids are literally made from their maple breakfast sausage and the amazing carnitas we make from their pasture-raised pork. But from regeneratively raised raw dairy products to the organic potato chips made in regenerative lard, or anything you might get at your local farmer's market, our family's overall wellness and the security of our food lies in the hands of Farm Match and Real Food Club. I am so excited to be sharing about Farm Match and Real Food Club to offer Future Generations podcast listeners 10% off your first order. You can find the code and link in the show notes. Enjoy the rest of the show. Love and appreciate you all. The desire to go off-grid and disconnect from the system was one of the single most important initiatives any household could have. Whether it is growing our own food, becoming sovereign in our energy production and usage, establishing alternative communication strategies, or digging a well and finding the infinity of primary water. About a year and a half ago, our family moved into our new home in North County, San Diego, on 3 acres of precious land here in America's finest county. One of the first things we did was hire Food Forest Abundance to design a regenerative layout for our land. From the different trees to plant differing berry guilds and synergistic pollinators, to consulting on alternative energy, collecting our rainwater, and even helping us find our local well guy, Food Forest Abundance and their Freedom Farm Academy has been pivotal in the gradual and consistent evolution of our household towards true sovereignty from the system. They have helped us simplify a very confusing process and helped us create the design of our dreams. It doesn't matter if you have 3 acres, dozens or hundreds, or just a small yard. Food Forest Abundance has something to offer you and your family in your journey to move your entire household off-grid. Use the code TheFutureGen to work with the absolute best in the world, Food Forest Abundance, to create your own freedom farm and get off-grid at a discounted rate. Welcome to another episode of the Future Generations podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Stanton Hom. This episode with Hope Schachter is easily one of the most alarming. It's going to be split up into 2 episodes because it just could not be edited and could not be shortened, because parents like Hope, Mother of Autumn, need to be seen, heard, and valued more than virtually every other parental experience today, largely because this is one of the biggest vulnerabilities that I have that's been keeping me up at night for years. The whole subject surrounding medical kidnapping, especially surrounding families that actually just do care about taking personal responsibility, having high consciousness around your choices, customizing your child's journey to optimal wellness. And at some point, God forbid, you have to go to the hospital for whatever reason. In this case, it was a bad case of diarrhea, a radical misdiagnosis, misprognosis, a teaching hospital, belligerent staff, and then what seems like a consistent effort to make an example of a type of parent. And in the middle of it is a child that is being manipulated through pharmacological procedures, aggressive, off-label, forced medications, but real loss for some time of custody of their child. And in the end, the child is caught in the middle. And in the wake of that level of trauma that gets essentially stuck and stored in this child's nervous system is the fallout, right? And I've heard from many influencers who have left California, and this is not California-based, but that have left California with the fear that they may be targeted when they go into the system And, if you did not listen to the episode with Gail McCrae, I highly encourage you going back to listen to that one after this one, because Gail and Remnant Healthcare were key factors in helping mitigate many of the risks as much as they could of this family. I believe Hope to be one of the and Autumn, the canaries in the coal mine that in every state, in every hospital system, if you don't know that law enforcement isn't there to protect you, to protect and serve you, the public, but to enforce the hospital standards and sometimes to support and back up child protective services as they are in the state of California, every state, you're at risk of this. Every state has policies that essentially, on the front end, because of medical, quote, standard of care, they can have their will. They could wage virtual pharmacological war in your children, and there is not much that you can do about it in many cases unless you take action as based on part one of this particular episode. I'm grateful for Hope. I'm sad for Hope. I'm sad for Autumn. And every day I pray for this family, and every day I pray for families like theirs, and I pray for families like ours who just care about making choices with critical thought behind them and continually offering, as much for our children outside of the system that aims to enslave our children. And in the end, I'm very blessed. I'm very blessed and very moved by this interview. I hope you listen. I hope you take it in. I hope you recognize the gravity of it. And I hope you build in for your family those solutions necessary to protect your child. Love and appreciate you all. Enjoy this episode. Welcome to the Future Generations podcast, providing you with the world-changing content necessary to inspire you, your family, and our planet to a life of optimal health potential. We'll help you make the choices that powerfully influence the lives you bring into this world. It's time to strengthen our resolve, do better now, and for our future generations. I'm your host, Dr. Stanton Hom. Okay, welcome to another episode of the Future Generations podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Stanton Hom, and I have with me a very, very special guest who's the mother of an extremely special guest. And I want to preface this conversation with Hope Schachter, mom, and Autumn Shaw, daughter, with the fact that the majority of parents that are listening to this podcast, either this is acutely in the front of your mind every time something happens to your child and you may have to enter the system, or it is in the back of your mind, in your subconscious, that is literally driving a lot of your decisions or the lack of some decisions. And it's the subject of medical kidnapping. Hope, I read the article you sent. I watched a few videos on you. I've had several conversations with Gail McCrae, who we just had on the podcast, talking about the greater subject of medical kidnapping and how to potentially protect your family from this. And I immediately asked if she would invite you to the podcast, because I just think that this is such an important conversation. As I was sharing before we hit record, I'm sorry, so sorry that you guys have to have been on the receiving end of this and feeling the fallout of such things. But I would love for you to introduce yourself so our audience gets to know you both personally and professionally, and then we can get started.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you again for being willing to share Autumn's story. My name is Hope. I am really just a mom. I don't have, active, social media profile or anything like that. I wasn't like this freedom fighter necessarily. I was just focused on my family. But I was a prior marriage and family therapist, and a holistic nutritionist myself, before becoming a mother, and had decided to stay home, with my children when we started a family, at the end of 2019. I'm happy to get into Autumn's story whenever you're ready. But that's kind of all there is that, I was just a regular mom. And that's what I want the audience to really relate to, is that this was not some activist who has a big story to tell. It was an everyday person that didn't see themselves winding up in this situation. You hear about them all the time in the news and you think it won't happen to you.
It's, I would say it's what makes our entire world go round at Future Generations. Like for the last 13 years of clinical practice, but also the last 4 years of this podcast, it's essentially all about moms, and it's also. I had no interest in having any sort of platform or anything like that, and I think it's because when you're just a dad, and sometimes I say a dad and a doc, like, and you just tell stories and you just tell things that are important, then they have really, really, really good reach when they have such a significance. And so I have heard of medical kidnapping over the last, I want to say over the last 7 or 8 years. It wasn't the first part of my practice. I don't know why, but I feel like it is amplified. And I've heard it for cancer therapies. That's a big one. I have heard it for nutritional diets and deeming parents unfit because they believe that the children is somehow malnourished, and amplified with something as wild as your story, like thinking that there's this indigestion, there's this tummy issue, there's this, maybe, you're doing the right thing of like, hey, intussusception, like you're doing the right thing by even going in potentially with that, big of an issue. And then you end up a completely different avenue. And I would love for you to share the story, because I think it's so important.
Yeah. So, it's interesting to have a child who has a tummy ache, especially because my toddler had a tummy ache for a few days to start. And then it ends in Autumn fighting for her life on a ventilator with the involvement of Child Protective Services. So I can go ahead and get started if you're ready for that.
Yeah, I am.
Okay. So last fall, my toddler, he had diarrhea for about 3 days, and he was completely himself. He was running around acting like a little wild man, like he normally does. And you wouldn't know he was like sick per se, other than that when he would have a bowel movement, he would have diarrhea. So a few days of that, and then he was fine. And a couple of days later, my 4-year-old Autumn, she pointed to her tummy and she said, it hurts right here, but I can't go to the bathroom. Now, our family, we are fire victims, and I do feel like Autumn's constitution is very sensitive. So having constipation is not completely abnormal for her. Typically, if I give her maybe a little extra magnesium, that's supportive, but I knew that her brother had just had this tummy issue. So I was like, okay, well, let's see where this goes. So the next day, Autumn points to her tummy again. She says, it hurts right here, but I can't go potty. And then she threw up. So I called my husband and had him come home, and Autumn started to have diarrhea around the clock every 20 minutes. Now we have a toddler who is cutting toddler molars. We have a newborn, and my daughter is crying, help me, every 20 minutes. And she isn't eating a ton. She is drinking just fine. And we are obviously pushing fluids with diarrhea. But she kind of develops what looks like jelly stool. And I contribute that to maybe the fact that she's not really eating a lot of food. So there's nothing to get out. Like her body is just really forceful with trying to get it out. But I had some like alarm bells going off that this is not just like kind of a normal tummy bug. Right. So after 3 days of no one getting any sleep, we went to urgent care, and they told us, well, if her brother just had something, then it's probably the same thing. And we can't test her stool unless she can prevent urine from getting in the test. And she had just turned 4. I mean, for an adult, that's hard when you have diarrhea to make sure there's no urine. So they sent us home with a little urine cup and said, you can drop it off if you're able to catch something separate from urine. And so we brought those cups home, and then 2 more days go by, and it's still every 20 minutes around the clock. So this is 5 days now. And, we're exhausted. And I'm just still getting those alarm bells. Like something is off. Like this is so different than my toddler. Yes, Autumn is very sensitive, but just so different. And so we went back to urgent care. We went to a different urgent care. And they briefly mentioned intussusception. So I look it up, which is a small intestinal or colon prolapse. And you have to go to the emergency room typically to get often some sort of enema, often an air enema is what's described online. But the main symptoms is jelly stools and diarrhea every 15 to 20 minutes. And it was to every 20 minutes to the T. Like I could be like, we have 2 more minutes and then she's going to have diarrhea. I could count it. Wow. So we decided to go to the emergency room because they won't do a pediatric ultrasound or pediatric CT scans at urgent care. And if she needed the enema, that's where she would have to go anyway. So we were pretty sure that's what it was. And we went to the emergency room. And that morning, my husband had actually, because we were like trying to figure out can we catch any stool? Well, at least maybe bring a urine for urine analysis. And I remember saying like, she's had diarrhea for 5 days. I'm sure she's somewhat dehydrated. And he was like, no, she'll fill the whole thing up. And she did. Like she was urinating consistently. But at the emergency room, they actually said that they could test her stool even if she got urine in it. And so they did the stool test and they did a pediatric ultrasound. They said it's not intussusception. We actually pushed to do a CT scan. So, for any like crunchy granola parents out there, like I was very concerned in order to get a CT scan. And so this was not any form of negligence, which will later get, pushed on us as parents. And so they again said she did not have intussusception, and they, are telling us they could keep her overnight for fluids. And we're just kind of at a bit of a loss. And then, they come running in and telling us that she has pediatric E. coli, which is not treated at that hospital and should have to go to a children's hospital. And they're consulting with Lucille Packard, which is affiliated with Stanford. And that is a teaching hospital. And I know that because I actually worked there myself when I was not yet licensed. And so I was uncomfortable with students performing any sort of medical interventions on my child. And, they kept saying, well, they're more specialized. And yet I'm dealing with, actual doctors, not students at the local emergency room. So I felt uncomfortable, but they're telling me that she has this syndrome called HUS, which is a issue with basically E. coli releases this toxic byproduct as it's broken down, and it can impact kidney function. And so they will need to give her diuretics, which will help flush these byproducts out of the kidneys. I would actually later find out after our, medical hostage situation at Lucille Packard, once we left and we were able to get Autumn out of the hospital, that she never met all 3 criteria for HUS. She actually only met 1. That's not what I'm being told. So, I can continue on if that's okay with you about at least getting us to Lucille Packard, unless you have more questions.
No, that's great. Keep going.
Okay. So, they tell us they need to administer a diuretic, and what they'll be using is called Lasix. And Lucille Packard is the one that's informing them of this. And the nurse lets me know that it is kind of typical for it to work within an hour, but most patients do not make it to the restroom past like the 20-minute mark. They urinate themselves. And so that is almost exactly what happens for Autumn, is that she has this massive urine output and diarrhea. And I just started to get alarm bells. Like, this is a child's system that has been under assault. Right. And this seems extremely forceful. And so, they are telling us that, we'll have to be transported to Lucille Packard via an ambulance, but it's going to take a long time. And so we ask if we can drive her, and the air in the room clearly shifts. Like, you don't want an AMA, wow, because that's what you would have to do if you don't take the ambulance. So, I'm sensing that. And the ambulance actually arrives quicker than they thought. And we had Autumn, she's fully potty trained, but we had her in cloth diapers because we actually live in a very rural area in the mountains. And so getting to the local emergency room is quite a drive, and pulling over every 20 minutes to make it. Sometimes you won't make it to get her to go to the bathroom. So she had cloth diapers, and On the ambulance ride to Lucille Packard, she urinates so much that she has wet through her cloth diaper and through her pants. And so I'm seeing so much urine come from such a small child. And something really doesn't sit right. Now, when we get to Lucille Packard, they keep having doctors come in to introduce themselves. And I say, great, are you the attending? And no, I'm a resident. And I'm saying, okay, well, I want to speak with the attending. And that starts to kind of get some hostility. Well, do you have a problem with residents? Like, have you had an issue in the past? Like, no, I just want to speak with the doctor who is a specialist, who will be treating my child. And so eventually the attending comes in and is very annoyed. He's saying things like, she could die in front of her. Now, Autumn has been through so much in her little life. We literally lost everything in a fire. We lived in temporary housing. We had to buy this fixer-upper, live in an RV. Like, she had a baby brother, then very quickly had a baby sister unexpectedly. She has been through so much. Yeah. And so saying something like that in front of a child, I'm telling them, can we bring everyone's nervous system down? Because Autumn is very sensitive. And if she's being pumped with adrenaline and cortisol, she's not going to get better. And I'm asking them to speak to me in the hallway. And, they don't seem to want to do that. They just burst into her room. And they're telling me all these diuretics that they're going to be using as these cocktails. And they tell me that HUS is up and down and back and forth. And, some kids need lifelong dialysis and some don't. And I'm just, feeling like it's like they don't actually know. They don't have a treatment. They just have a protocol. And then they don't know the mechanisms by which this syndrome operates. So they just do what they can. And so, on his way out, the attending flippantly turns around and lifts his hand in the air and says, "She'll be our case study of the week." Obviously I have concerns about her being seen that way as a case study, as an experiment. They keep bringing these medications in, and she's starting to rapidly decline. But I'm requesting that we space them out, because I know just from my time in medicine, although I am not a doctor or nurse, I am, again, just a therapist and a nutritionist who has worked in these environments before, that most medications are not studied in conjunction with one another. So if Autumn had a side effect or an allergic reaction, we actually wouldn't know what it was coming from. And so I'm being told I am resistant to her treatment. And at one point, they say they want to add aminophylline. And I'm saying, okay, well, how far away can we space that from what she just took? And, they're being extremely pushy with me. And I let them give it to her, and Autumn throws up blood. And they push back against me. They want to give this cocktail again, as we're seeing her enter kidney failure, which, later we found out that these diuretics, the primary side effect is kidney injury and kidney failure. But we weren't given informed consent about that. And so, she winds up throwing up blood again, and they finally remove the aminophylline. But it was only because I was able to point out the fact that you've given this, that you have spaced it out, that because of my request, right? We know that one is causing her to throw up blood. And so they remove it. But, throughout this process, they're just fighting me every step of the way. And Autumn does that first day enter kidney failure. So she stops producing any urine when just the day before she had been urinating just fine. And so it is very obvious to me that this cocktail has resulted in the kidney failure. Along with that, they're telling us that Autumn will potentially need dialysis. Right when we arrive, they tell us that that's a risk. And to me, that might be a risk because of the medications they use. But I didn't know that at the time, right? But I'm saying, okay, well, we want Dad to donate blood if she needs a transfusion, because that's kind of a part of the whole dialysis kind of workup that they do as a potential transfusion. And so that we are met with even more hostility about and told, well, that lab has a really long turnaround, and it takes a while to get an appointment, and we'll have them contact you today. And over, the progression of the next handful of days, that's what they keep telling us morning and afternoon. Eventually, it actually turns into the first threat of a court order with our family about a blood transfusion. Now, I want everyone to know this isn't just about pharmaceutical products that a child could be exposed to with a transfusion, because I had some news publications that reached out to me about the COVID vaccine. But actually, I've mentioned in every podcast that the concern for a parent really should be that if you read the paperwork, they make you sign away all liability to the hospital, and it outlines everything your child could be exposed to, like HIV. On top of that, this is your child. And I had a roommate in college who would donate blood for money that I would never want sharing body fluids with my child. And I don't know if someone is a smoker, an alcoholic. I don't know their health status. I don't know what medications they're on, birth control pills, statins, who knows, right? And that those body fluids would be filling my child. So there is risk all around. And if you have the opportunity to choose who donates blood that you're comfortable with, I don't see how it's any of the hospital's business, really. Right. It's none of their business. And so we get to a place of dialysis, which I can get to in just a moment, but and she does wind up needing a transfusion, and they're threatening a court order. And my husband calls the lab, finally, says he wants to speak to a supervisor, and they say they can fit him in within 30 minutes. And that's in the evening, I believe. The next day, they said they're going to pursue a court order to get Red Cross blood. And my husband calls the lab and says, it's life or death. How soon can you get me this blood? And they said, oh, we can have it to you before 6 p.m. today. So we were told this was like a 7 to 10 day process, and it wound up being like 1 day. So that's really concerning. But additionally, why weren't the doctors calling and saying this is life or death? My husband is calling the lab saying this is life or death. So it's just really, it's so odd to me that they don't partner with the parents, Now, once Autumn had entered kidney failure, they're telling me that she needs to go receive a constant drip of these diuretics in the ICU. And in order to do that, Autumn will have to receive a bladder catheter. And now she had received bladder scans consistently that first day. And they're telling me how much urine she's creating has gone down to nothing, right? And so I'm saying, well, I would understand doing something traumatic. These are my daughter's genitals that were going to be, violated in a way, that she can't truly consent to this kind of procedure. And if there's urine and she wasn't able to pee, I would understand. But if there's no urine, then can't you just do consistent bladder scans until there is, and we can prompt her to urinate? And then if she can't, then we can, obviously do a catheter if that's warranted. And I am met with so much hostility that I am told they bring down an ICU doctor to tell me that that is the standard of care. And if I don't want to do that, if I'm unwilling, then then she won't be treated any further, and we'll have to be medevaced if she needs dialysis. Now, Autumn's in kidney failure, so she is going to need dialysis. So we are put in a position where we don't really have a choice. And so we were forced into this urinary catheter. And so, that as part of that whole idea of, the way that my daughter's body is being violated, that will play out, throughout her life around consent. So we moved her to the ICU. She's on this constant drip, and they start adding additional diuretics. So she'd already been on Lasix and Diarrhea. And then they start adding Bumex, and they're telling me it's the equivalent. Now, once I leave the hospital, I also find out that Bumex is not approved for pediatric use, and it is 40 to 50 times more potent than Lasix. And it is constantly in her system, along with Diarrhea and Lasix. So there is no improvement. Obviously, with kidney failure and this forcefulness on her kidneys. Now, at some point in this process between the constant drip and the dialysis, I do get in touch with Gail, and she confirms what my intuition about what was happening is true, is that the tubules in the kidneys are altered by diuretics in terms of their electrolyte exchange. And it creates a lot of inflammation because of the mucus that lines those tubules that are impacted by that electrolyte exchange. And so that inflammation is what contributes to kidney damage and renal failure. And so, I had said before the constant drip, like, if she's going to need dialysis anyway, shouldn't we give the kidneys a break and just maybe do dialysis? Not that I want dialysis for her, but, and along with my concerns around dialysis, it wasn't until we left the hospital and we connected with a nephrologist who is supportive of medical freedom and has worked with families in cases of medical kidnapping, that he told me that he was both surprised and not surprised that they would perform traditional dialysis on Autumn when there was the option of peritoneal dialysis, which is simply saline that is run through a tube in her stomach. Instead, they perform a very invasive procedure on Autumn's neck to put a port. And there are issues with that port. Autumn is very small. It is very high risk. And I tell them from the start that I'm not comfortable with a student performing that on my child. And I am assured by the attending that while she can't perform that because it's a teaching hospital, that she will be right there next to the fellow, who is a doctor, not quite a resident, but doesn't have special training. So, I'm not comfortable, but I take my toddler and my newborn at the time, and my husband waits outside the room. And this is when we actually start to find out that Autumn, like me, does not do well with sedatives. I have a very high tolerance. So they're having issues keeping her sedated during the procedure. And when I come back, my husband says they made a mistake. They made it too long. And she's bleeding excessively. And they're going to have to open it up and redo it. And the attending is not in the room. And the fellow, she's in the hallway on the computer, and the fellow is finishing the procedure on her own. And this would actually result in days of Autumn bleeding out of her neck where she would not move. She was like this, and she would not move, and she would cry, and she would say, my neck is bleeding. And they would have to continue to try to resuture it, and they would not give her sedatives. So I'm restraining her while she is screaming, my neck, please make them stop. But they are, this little graphic if people are listening, the children, but, when she would scream, more blood would come out because your neck tightens. Yeah. I'm begging for, like, can we try Ativan? This is 2 hours of using alcohol swabs on her neck. Like, this is just more than like a child should have to endure. And eventually we say, like, I didn't know that well about the different things that happen with dialysis, and they can actually do a chest port. That's typically for long-term dialysis, I guess. But she bled out all night, one night on her pillows. And she's screaming, take it out, and she has not urinated. We're having to just continue dialysis. And I know that her body has an open wound. It thinks it has an open wound. And so is it really going to bring her kidneys back online right now? No, the focus is on the open wound. Like, what is happening here? We are bleeding out. And so we demand to have the neck port removed and to schedule her for a chest port. And they say they don't want to do that until Monday. And this is on, I believe, a Saturday or Sunday morning. And they agree. And I say, if you have to put it in for emergency dialysis in the middle of the night, fine. But we're taking it out to do a chest port because she cannot bleed out for longer. Like, this is days and days of her bleeding. Sorry, it's hard to revisit that. So they remove it. And within like an hour, Autumn starts to pee. And I get goosebumps because I, have been, like, I knew that her body was not going to heal with that open wound. And so, I'm like, okay, we're finally going to be able to leave. And so the doctors come in and they tell us that it's great that she's starting to urinate. So the next step would be to administer Lasix. And I'm, what? Like, no, we're not going to do that.
It's wild.
So this results in, days of them, because I'm saying no, the days of them, like fluid loading her, and then she needs to be drinking, and then saying, I'm saying, well, she's starting to gain a lot of water weight, and it feels unnatural if she's not thirsty to force her to drink. And she's not urinating that much. It's slow. And they'll say, oh, that was a charting error. Don't do that. And it's like, well, obviously in my mind, I feel like they're fluid loading her so then they can make a case for these diuretics.
Mm-hmm.
So, with the help of Gail and some of her fellow medical advocates through Remnant Nursing, who we actually wound up connecting with through Blessed by His Blood and Pure Blood Registry, because Autumn did need subsequent transfusions. And I really appreciate that those organizations allow you to talk with and meet donors, because, we wanted our comfort level beyond just like the normal, okay, are you a safe person? And even into like, what is your lifestyle like, people that we could connect with, and get a comfort for that. So through those medical advocates, we wound up, like finding a gentler diuretic that takes typically about 4 hours, that we, after so many days of fluid loading her, we felt we had to wind up using. And it did increase her urine output. It is much less harsh on the system. And my fear was just, right, like the kidneys finally come back online and then we create all this inflammation again and they shut down. But that did not happen through support like Gail, and there are little bits and pieces I am skipping over here, like the fact that Autumn's begging for milk, and then Gail's telling me we need to check her calcium, and they're fighting me on it. And Gail's saying, this could be a risk to her heart if we give her, they wanted to give her K-oxalate to help with her, I believe it's her potassium levels. And then they do check, and her calcium is low because Autumn doesn't like milk. If she's begging me for milk, her body is intelligent, So she winds up releasing one day so much fluid. She had gained over 6 pounds in water weight.
Wow.
And in 36 hours, she's losing almost all of it. Now, that day they tell me, you know what, we're going to challenge her kidneys. So we're going to have you drink 1.5 liters of water. And they had already threatened court order once. They've talked about bringing in the respect team because of all the questions I ask, which respect is supposed to be about like mediation, but they didn't wind up bringing in the team, but it's really not, and I'm consulting their pharmacists and working with Remnant to get an understanding of every medication that they're mentioning. So they want us to push all these fluids on her in one day. I have some resistance, but she's urinating so much that I'm like, okay, well, maybe it'll get us out of here sooner. And by that evening, Autumn starts throwing up water. And I am expressing concern, and they're telling me she'll be fine until the morning staff comes, and just feed her ice chips. But she is also begging me for water. So I'm giving her ice chips. She's throwing them up, and yet her body seems to think she's dehydrated. Now, she has lost over 6 pounds in less than 2 days. And so, I keep, requesting to speak to the doctor. Are they sure? If they send me a resident, she'll be fine till morning. And so around 4:30 in the morning, she has finally fallen asleep, not for very long. And she has me cuddling her in the hospital bed, and she clearly wet the bed. And I said, Autumn, is everything okay? And she says something weird about her dad and her brother. And she's not looking at me. She's looking up and to the left. And so I get out of the bed and I walk around and look at her face, and her eyes are darting back and forth, and Autumn is having a seizure.
Wow.
So I, obviously get the nurses, and she is rushed down for a CT scan. She is given Ativan, and originally the neurologist who comes to speak to me tells me that Autumn is showing some good signs. They don't have a major concern, but she's not opening her eyes. Now, she has been administered a sedative. It's extremely bright lights back in the ICU. And the ICU fellow comes charging in, yelling at me that we must do an MRI because she's having a hypertensive episode and she could have had a stroke. And so I speak with Gail, and Gail's like, I don't know that I would do that. And I was like, Gail, the energy here is really bad. And so I consent to the MRI, and they're telling me that they'll have to sedate her. Right before they put her under, Autumn opens her eyes and looks at her dad and says, is it morning time? Can I have coffee with mommy? And then she goes under. And so they take her down for an MRI, and they bring her back, and we keep saying, when are you going to take her off of the ventilator? And they are telling us, oh, we're going to wait till this afternoon. Oh, we're going to wait till this evening. And I'm saying, well, I don't see any changes in whatever it is you're looking for. They're talking about like PEEP and all this stuff. And I'm starting to reach out to Remnant to speak to a respiratory therapist. And they tell me that she has a little bit of fluid on her lungs, and they would expect someone totally normal like Autumn to, it'd just be a few more hours. And by late that night when they're about to leave, I'm saying, I'm not seeing the needle move. So what are the next steps? And I am assured that she's not anywhere different than she needs to be. They're telling me that the ventilator will provide compression to move fluid out of the lungs, which I know that ventilators aren't a treatment. They are a stopgap. Right. And so they're telling me, well, it will be an evolving conversation. And I say, well, okay, I guess we can, revisit in the morning. But until then, I want to be notified about every medication that Autumn is given. And that night, they wake me up to tell me that they're going to give her Ativan. They wake me up to tell me that they're going to give her fentanyl. They wake me up to try to give her Tylenol. And Autumn has never even taken Tylenol. My child had never been sick before. So all these medications are just overwhelming. I actually declined Tylenol because I was like, they're saying it's for pain. And I said, you just gave her fentanyl. And then I woke up at 4:30 in the morning, and her heart rate was really high. And I said, why is her heart rate so high? And he said, yeah, I don't know. We just had to give her blood pressure medication too, which I had technically consented to when she first when she first went into the ICU after the seizure. But then I said, well, what changed? Like, what changed in the night? And he said, I don't know. We gave her the Lasix about an hour ago. And I was horrified because I said, if you had looked at her chart, you would have known we'd been avoiding those medications for like weeks at this point. Wow. We had chosen a gentler diuretic. I was told that this would be an evolving conversation, and it is not legal to administer a medication without my consent. And I told them that I would be filing a grievance. Within 24 hours, CPS showed up. Now, they were just telling us that, we needed to comply with some things like Keppra to like prevent seizures. Now, I'm trying to speak with outside pharmacists and other medical providers to get an understanding, like, is Keppra our only option? What are the risks with Keppra? Because one of the neurologists who briefly came to speak with me also said that Keppra can be a risk to the kidney. She said, I want you to know that. And then the pharmacist that works for Stanford is saying, oh, no. And so I want an outside opinion. And so they're saying that we are not in compliance over all of these things like a PICC line, which they had just put 3 new IVs in Autumn. And I'm saying, well, if we have 3 new IVs, like, why would we torture her and give her a PICC line? Like, what, I want to know the justifications for these things, which of course the doctors don't like. They're not met with that very often. And so the next morning, we have sadly complied to things that we would not have, like the PICC line. They actually came in, and Autumn had developed a fever. Gail is advocating for them to test her sputum because at this point, she's been on the ventilator for days, and she could have developed ventilator-associated pneumonia, which we were later confirmed. But they don't perform PICC lines on children with active infection. So we have to sign away all liability. And so the vascular team is saying, we don't do this. But because of CPS, we are being told we have to. So we complied with everything. And the next morning, CPS contacts me and says, your hearing will be at 1 p.m. And I said, why? Like, we have complied with everything. And she's telling me, well, the doctors say you're not in compliance. And I said, well, her medical record would prove otherwise. And so we have just hours to, find a lawyer. Then, we're told right before the hearing that they have been informed that we are in compliance and that we will still be going before a judge to have Autumn removed from our care.
So many people have asked me what I do to stay mentally and physically resilient in the midst of the unending polarization, fear, and tyranny. Literally nothing has made a bigger impact for me than daily cold plunging. 3 minutes, 37 degrees every morning for over a year now. My friends, I wanted to tell you about the Edge Tub from Edge Theory Labs. Their portable and inflatable tub can alternate between an ice bath and hot tub. I've been regenerating the benefits of cold plunging every day, like better sleep, better focus, and more energy. We have had some really amazing interviews to learn more about cold exposure. But in the meantime, I invite you to check out Edge Theory Labs' website to learn more. I'm also happy to share an exclusive offer for Future Generations podcast listeners, $150 off using the code TheFutureGen. You can find more info in the show notes. Get cold. What's up, FG fam? One of the single best companies whose products have supported the optimal wellness of our family for years is Earthly Wellness. Kate TG and her team have stood for truth, health, and freedom in ways that paved the way for so many of us. They experienced heavy levels of censorship long before it was popularized, and they stood strong and persevered. Their products are clean, cost-effective, and honestly, they work for all ages. From supporting my wife, our oldest, and our little guy, Earthly Wellness provides products that have been foundational for our family for years. We especially use their products right before bedtime. Their Feel Better Fast and other herbal tinctures are some of the best in the world, as well as their amazing Goodnight Lotion, the magnesium oil, are mainstays. I am so excited to be partnering with Earthly to offer Future Generations podcast listeners 10% off your first purchase. You can find the code link in the show notes. Enjoy the rest of the show. Love and appreciate you all.
Autumn at this point is, she is so, they can't properly sedate her. She is thrashing. She is from the morphine. She is trying to grab at the tube. She has wrist restraints on. Her eyes are rolling in different directions. We, go into this hearing not having any due process. We don't have any paperwork. Yeah. We were told that we did actually find a lawyer in this state who wanted to show up for us on this Zoom hearing. But we were told at the start of the hearing that you have to have a special dependents court training in order to represent parents. And so he wouldn't be able to represent us, and we had to have someone assigned to us. Now, we later learned that actually only the judge needs that training, but we were told that no one of our choice could represent us. And so even the attorney that was assigned to us tried to argue due process. And the judge says in the hearing, like, I'm aware that we are violating the due process of these parents, which is a civil rights issue. Like, we have the case for a civil rights suit in that regard. Of course, they won't give us our court transcript. But they have these things against us, which this attorney hasn't received all the documents. We don't receive them until after the hearing. All of these things are not legal. And in the hearing, they really tried to deem us as unfit, I believe, to cover themselves for all of the medical mismanagement and, potential malpractice at this point. And they say things like, when Autumn is unable to be properly sedated to get comfortable, they are, they have been issuing now diuretics, that we didn't want to consent to, but felt coerced into. And they have her in diapers, and they are disposable diapers. And they want to change her very frequently. And when they do, they use cold wipes. Now, if she is finally calm and they use cold wipes on her, she becomes hysterical. Wow. And at this point, we believe that Autumn was actually experiencing hallucinations from all of they were bolusing things like ketamine, fentanyl. She's on constant propofol drip. And they say in this hearing, when I had requested, so this is my side, I had requested that these are disposable absorbent diapers. If she is just urinating, could we wipe her every other diaper change? Because when she is sedated, putting her into distress is not worth it, because then she has to be administered more medications. And just for a child to experience this, I mean, her wrists are tied to her bed, and instead, in the letter that the doctors wrote to the court, they said that the parents are requesting to leave the child soiled, which implies that I'm expecting my daughter to sit in her bowel movements. The way that they tried to paint us as parents is horrific. And I think one of the things that will never leave my experience is that Autumn is not able to be properly sedated on this Zoom hearing. I'm sitting in the bathroom with the door open. My husband is with my toddler and my newborn. We don't have any extended family. We have no help. And she is thrashing, and her eyes are rolling around, and she's pointing at things she's scared of. I can tell that she is afraid. I'm sure she's seeing things. And the CPS workers, who have to be mid-20s at most, have these smirks on their faces as they paint these lies. I wrote a correction and objections letter that was 10 pages long to all of the things that they tried to describe about us. They say that someone was in the room when they first came to visit that was recording, even though they specifically said it wasn't a conversation that could be recorded. And they have no proof of that because the person that was actually there was for religious reasons. This was someone praying over Autumn. Wow. The fact that they would include something that they have no evidence of as a lie, like the collusion, it's terrifying. It is truly terrifying. And it's also amazing because my husband is law enforcement and they did not care. They did not care. They were willing to paint us in any fashion to, obtain control over Autumn. And they, unfortunately for them, but a absolute blessing for us, as sad as it was to have complied under coercion, was that they couldn't technically take Autumn away. We were in compliance. Our medical record would prove that. And so they did issue what they call a sua sponte. And another reason that our civil rights were violated is that she actually says, the judge says, I spoke to my mentor and this is what he said I should do. So she had already decided before the hearing ever proceeded what she was going to do. And the sua sponte that she issued was that if there was anything that we weren't consenting to that was a life-saving measure, that Lucille Packard could override our decision. But that could be anything. That could be Tylenol. So what rights do we really have at that point? This, I know I've been talking a lot, but okay. This goes on to, the extent that Autumn is, like the nurses are saying, this is unsafe. This child is not safe to remain intubated. They have a babysitter, a CNA, next to her bedside to hold her wrists, even though they are restrained, to hold down her shoulders so that she can't move, to try to hold her head completely still, holding this child's head still. And they tell me that, they're willing to extubate her now that she has been on this ventilator for so many days. And, that ICU doctor that we actually were sent information about, how her husband had written articles for the New York Times about the amazing benefits of ventilator use in the ICU. So we do believe that there were some sort of financial ties beyond just the hospital alone. Given that Autumn was kept for almost 6 days on a ventilator, and we were consulting with respiratory therapists that said a child should never be on a ventilator with these numbers. Like her PIP and her PEEP were as though she were breathing normal air. Wow. We actually had a local doctor who he had worked prior as a home healthcare doctor who does ventilators at home. He left the ICU. He worked there for something like 20 or 30 years. And he requested her medical records. And that's when they decided to extubate her. And originally they were saying, she'll need BiPAP for a week. Now, at one point in the process of her being ventilated, they had even mentioned we could do BiPAP as an alternative, but she would have to be even more sedated because most kids don't like it, but it's far less invasive. And so many of the things that they've done, like the option of peritoneal dialysis instead of regular dialysis, they, at a student facility where they're practicing, they want to do these more invasive options because that's their opportunity to learn, right? And so I'm not being notified of all these options until I'm held hostage in a different situation, right? And so when she's, on the BiPAP, finally, something that I think is worth noting, I do think that they set up for Autumn for failure with extubation because they bolused her with morphine and fentanyl all night, saying that's what they at least had to try before extubation to see if they could continue her being properly sedated on a ventilator. Wow. And so would a child be able to breathe normally when you've been given morphine and fentanyl all night? Of course not, so just by the grace of God, Autumn was able to breathe on her own. Enough to be supported with BiPAP. And then even with that, the respiratory therapist I was consulting with was like, she could be taken off BiPAP and even CPAP and just do high flow and see how she does. And with this other medical doctor who was an outsider now involved with her medical record, they originally told me it would be a week of BiPAP and her sedatives. And instead it was less than 24 hours. Wow. And Autumn was off of the sedatives and breathing on her own. And at that point, they did try to play chess with us. They started to say that they would have to keep Autumn for weight management. This will be kind of wrapping up. There are many other things that occurred, but I just want to kind of continue on to how they played this game with us was, when she was on BiPAP, she had ripped out her feeding tube and she has this huge mask on her face. And I said, I wanted to get compliance with that first. So could we do an IV of nutrients? I'm forgetting in the moment what that is called, but she had done one before. And at first they're pushing back and saying no. And then they tell me, yes, okay, that's fine until she gets acclimated. But then by that night, she still hasn't received any nutrients. And I'm saying, well, what's going on? Why haven't you given her something? She has gone, how many weeks without food other than this feeding tube for a couple days on the ventilator. And they said, well, we're not going to give it to her until you let us put the feeding tube back in. So then she's just come off of sedatives and now we're going to restrain her, or are we going to sedate her again? Like, what are you going to do to force this feeding tube back in? So we got in a position where she had to get the feeding tube. And then they're, saying that they want to keep her for weight management. They bring in, now Autumn is on, when she is allowed to order food, she's on a renal diet. So I can't even order even butter, which is like a liquid, like they don't want because, all this stuff with the feeding tube, it's very specific, but these minerals in particular, like potassium and phosphorus, I am to avoid at all costs. She can't order anything that contains those. And so they're very strict about it, which I was fine with. But then they bring in these shakes for her. And I know by that brand that they make a kidney friendly shake. And I said, well, this is not renal friendly. This is standard. And so why would you be giving this to her if I can't even order her off the regular menu? I can only order for her off the kidney friendly menu. And the doctors start saying very, condescending things like, I appreciate your concern, But this is what the nutritionist ordered. And I said, well, I'm standing there saying, well, I want it documented that I am concerned about what you're about to give my daughter. And so they push back and I say, okay, like I'm not going to battle them at the moment, right? At least we have this home healthcare doctor on our side who's trying to get her out of here. And the next morning I wake up and, she's got this huge bag full of this shake. And I said, well, how much of this shake has she received? And they said, well, this is her third box. And I was like, third box? That seems like, I was concerned about one dose of these minerals. Like third box is scary. And so they send in the attending and the attending said, oops, oh, that was a mistake. She was only supposed to have water all night and one dose of this formula. So I'm like, her labs are going to make her kidneys look terrible and they're going to keep her. And by literally, again, another act of God, Autumn's kidney function panel came back normal. Well, it came back unchanged. So they had improved enough that she was considered stable enough to be able to go home, right? She doesn't need dialysis. Now they're talking chronic kidney disease because she's out of range for a 4-year-old, but enough that it could be managed at home or with outpatient dialysis if it came to that, right? And obviously this home healthcare doctor is a prior ICU doctor. He can manage her weight. We get the attending and say, we feel that, our doctor can manage her weight from home. He's willing to take her on, and he can meet her at the house. They've tried to perform a feeding study with a feeding tube in, which is not going to be accurate because you can't perform a proper swallow that way. So we'll even bring her home with the feeding tube if that's what you want. And she said, well, I didn't allow you to talk to an outside doctor. I didn't consent to that. And I was like, what? And so, she leaves the room upset. And my husband is shaking and we call the home healthcare doctor and he says, I think you should get insurance involved. I think you should tell them that she qualifies for a lower level of care. They're not going to want to continue paying $10,000 a day for the ICU. Right. And if it's over weight management, they're probably going to tell you that she can go home. And so I contacted my insurance and I said, that this is just over her weight at this point. Her numbers are stable. And I am told that I need to file a grievance. Otherwise, we will have to assume responsibility for the fees incurred going forward. And I let the attending know. And she briefly leaves the room and then comes back and tells us that, we can go home. So yeah, if they're not going to get their money, right? Because I am crying. I'm saying, I can't afford the ICU out of pocket, lady. So are you going to be paying? Because CPS isn't going to pay. I didn't say that out loud, but I let them know, like, we can't afford out of pocket for what you're wanting to do. And this is weight management. And I was told I had 24 hours to file the grievance with my insurance. Otherwise I have to pay. And so we filed it. We drove out of the hospital and we pulled up to our driveway. It's like over an hour away. And they had given Autumn a sedative to try and pull out her PICC line. And it did nothing. My husband was like, it just did nothing. She was screaming. But she was obviously a little bit out of it. And when we got to our driveway, she said, wait, Mama, we're going home. I was like, yeah, we are home. We made it. And we did request her medical records. And, we had told everyone we were leaving, like, we will not be continuing care with Lucille Packard. And yet they still, 2 weeks later, we got her medical record. And, a week or two after we left, they were contacting my husband and saying they wanted her numbers for her blood pressure. And he said, we aren't in your care. We have a doctor. If you are concerned, you can call him. And they were still calling CPS and letting them know that they could not get a hold of Autumn's numbers and leaving the contact information for the home healthcare doctor. And that's, the last contact that we had was getting her record, was that they were still trying to control Autumn. And I do think, without people like Gail, who were willing to be on the phone with the doctors with me, and the fact that I had my own I had some credential that they would have to respect. There were times when they were speaking with me that I would say, I want to remind you that I used to work here. So can you speak to me as though I were a colleague, right? Like I am not some dumb parent. Um, and, there were times that they would send in, some manager to come talk to me about how, the nurses are scared of me. And I was like, I'm not yelling at these people. I'm just telling them I need to be informed of this. I need to be informed of that. And, if they're scared because I'm assertive, right? Like at one point we were told, I said, why, when with the direct donor blood, and I said, why is my husband the one calling? Why wouldn't you call to the medical team? They were like, well, you're the first time we've had to deal with this. And I said, I'm the first person who has insisted on direct donor blood. Well, I find that hard to believe. We did meet other parents who said, we were told we couldn't. And so we just did the Red Cross that they required. And I think it's very telling. And this is the part that I want people to really take away, is that as we were leaving, we had loaded Autumn up in the little wagon to get downstairs, all of our things. And as we're walking away, these young women knock on the door next door to us, the hospital room next door, and they say, Child Protective Services. So this is not just us. And we were told of another family when we were on the ICU that had CPS called on them as well. So you really don't think it will happen to you. But I was staring at my daughter who, when those sedatives were so bad, they came in one night in the middle of the night and they said, I'm sorry, but the hallucinations are so bad and we have her in the wrist restraints, but we're worried about her brain and we're going to have to administer an antipsychotic to my 4-year-old. She had never been on Tylenol.
Wow.
Yeah. So, I just want parents to really, to really understand that, like, you can think it's something small and wind up in a situation you could not even fathom. And for someone who, was not super into Western medicine and not against it, I really was trying to understand, all of the mechanisms of the medications that they were wanting to do. And once we left, I think one of the most profound things was this nephrologist who has been in support of our family in case CPS shows up again, to be able to say that we are monitoring her care. He said, I looked up childhood HUS on the up-to-date protocol website. So that's, I guess, a website that doctors can check for what is the most, up-to-date
standard of care.
Yes, standard. What is the true standard of care? And he said that Lasix and diuretics are not mentioned at all for childhood HUS.
It's insane.
Yeah.
Hope, I'm so sorry. I first want to thank you for being open and for being vulnerable and for sharing your story and Autumn's story. If you have more to share, you're welcome to. I know I said I had a hard stop, but I can't stop. And I feel, as we were sharing before we hit record, my daughter's just a couple weeks older. And my daughter also, she's highly sensitive, and they're the COVID babies, and they live through all of it. And, and then we share similar values of just, informed consent and just caring about choices and caring about our kids. And there's so many things that we could talk about. There's so many different avenues. And I think this is going to be a 2-part episode because I think there's just way too much. And I feel, on one end, like just like the contrast of being an assertive and conscious parent in the face of the belligerence of the medical team. Some included students, and there's being a student who's been through, a terminal degree. I'm a doctor of chiropractic. I'm not a medical provider. Do not want to be a medical provider. But being in that state of like a teaching clinic, like I worked at Cal State Fullerton for a while, and arguably we had one of the top teaching clinics. And if I compare myself now, which I consider myself, I'm 13 years in, I know a thing or two. Just how ignorant and how naive and how inexperienced and how little I knew. And at the same time, in our model of care, there's no room for ego. There's no room for that level of dogma. There's no room for that level of, animosity. especially when it's in the face of a loving parent, of a parent that actually cares.
I think what was profound for my husband, especially,
being in law enforcement too, that's so gnarly. I can't even imagine.
Well, that and like the fact that was just not respected at all,
Right.
which, not that he sees himself in this position of power, but certainly as supportive of, value and ethics and, and so, but for him, what was hardest was he would ask almost everyone a nurse, a doctor, every provider, do you have any kids? And the answer was always no. And
That's
so
crazy.
his follow-up would always be, well, what made you want to work with kids? And the response was almost always the same. Well, adults are so grumpy and all they say is no. And so it's about compliance. And I do, I said from the very beginning when we entered like this intense environment was that the ICU, intensive care, attracts people. And this is me as a therapist, right? Attracts people who are attracted to intensity.
Yeah. Hypervigilance.
Right? Yes. And so, and feeling power, maybe as a child, there was powerlessness, right? And power over. And children are an opportunity, especially when you don't have your own, to assert power. And so there was only one doctor in our experience who had a child who had an 18-month-old, and that was it. That was it.
Ballpark, how many providers that you ran into?
Oh my gosh, probably at least 30.
Yeah.
I would say at least 30 because, the way they do these shifts, it's very strange. And so that's why when people look at the medical record, it looks so confusing. And that we're like, well, that's not the doctor that was actually treating her. That's the weekend team. There's a night team. There's a day team. There's, and then that shift is different on the PICU, general care, ICU, they all operate differently. So
total duration of time that your daughter was
just over 5 weeks.
Oh man. And then total percentage of that time that she was intubated.
She was only intubated for about 6 days. Gotcha. But still that is far longer.
Yeah,
we kept being told, she shouldn't have been intubated at all. Right.
Yeah,
Originally, we actually only consented which I stated to the doctor was like, you're aware that we didn't actually consent to our daughter being on a ventilator. We consented to her being intubated for an MRI. And if there was any chance that this was going to be this is again a part of informed consent, that this was going to be a possible outcome, that we should have been informed of that and we should have consented to that. And of course, things like that are not met with, a lot of support. But at this point, I have to also present myself as an authority on my child. I can't seem as though I'm too emotional. Like at one point in that CPS hearing, they said that security was notified that I was screaming in the hallway that I needed to speak to a daughter because they're going to kill my child, which actually never happened. I went into the hallway because I was trying the whole morning that CPS was telling me that we weren't in compliance and we would have this hearing. I kept saying, well, her medical record will prove otherwise. And I keep requesting the doctor. And I would finally go before the hearing into the hallway and say, I want to speak to the doctor. What are we not in compliance on? And so, the lying that happened, there was just such mass collusion. And I think one of the, the best parts and why I continue to speak out for Autumn is I have to be able to look Autumn in the eye and say that, I didn't let it just be okay what they did to you. That she's the one who endures the consequences of the trauma. Like I described just a month or so ago, Autumn was in the kitchen with me, and, with kids, like whenever they're upset, it's not whatever they're saying they're upset about. Like it's always the straw that broke the camel's back. So she was upset about something like the color of the sippy cup, and she started crying. But then it became an absolute very quick breakdown into her screaming in the kitchen, "Mama, get me out of here." And it's just her and I in the kitchen,
No.
But, on top of that is that, these situations, they require you to, just to present yourself as a, not just authority, but as truly knowledgeable. And I think that parents don't parents don't realize that like this could happen, and a lot of them don't have the credentials. And so I want, the takeaway from this to also be to arm yourself with organizations like Remnant. And there's others, I know that Blessed by His Blood works with another organization, I think called Grace Services or something like that. To have like a team who can really arm you with their own credentials to be able to show up for you.
And how did you guys find Dr. Fox?
Dr. Fox, it was a very long, there were a lot of dead ends. I spoke to a lot of people that supposedly were going to help. They were going to make a call. They lead me back to someone I already spoke to or something. But we actually wound up getting connected, I believe, through Children's Health Defense with Free Now Foundation. And Dr. Fox actually is on the board. And it astounded me that I could not have created a caricature of what I needed, but he is both an attorney. He only defends his practice. He is an attorney. He is a former ICU doctor. He can do almost anything from home. He provides home health care, and his practice is at the bottom of the mountain where we live.
Wow.
I was just like, I literally could not have crafted an angel to step in that could have fit who Dr. Fox was for us. So, it's just an astounding story of, saving Autumn. Because additionally with Remnant, one of the reasons to arm yourself, which I wanted to get into as well, was that I keep speaking because I feel that maintaining transparency was so important, that when we were in the midst of it, when we were really fighting to keep Autumn in our care, that Remnant put out a call for action. And we had many phone lines shut down at the hospital of people simply saying, the world is watching and Autumn needs to go home. Wow. And so that the hospital would know that we were not in a vacuum, that there were people that were paying attention. And that's what I think is a protective measure for Autumn, is to continue to speak the truth, because, just add one important thing that I think is worth sharing, the extent of the lies that we'll go to, is we found a different letter in her medical record from the head of the ethics committee at Lucille Packard. And she describes herself as though she visited our family, which she never laid eyes on Autumn. I never left the room. After the CPS hearing, I didn't want them to not let me in, because if security removes me, they could make it so I can't see Autumn. Right. And then they would potentially have to appoint care because I'm considered, a threat. And so I did not leave her room for even a moment. Every podcast I did was in the bathroom to try to get resources and help. But the head of the ethics committee, when my husband looked her up on LinkedIn, which this letter she wrote had so many lies about, as though she had been a part of Autumn's care, which she never was. She is never in the medical record as having actually visited. Otherwise, it would have been recorded. Or so you would think, at least. But my husband looked her up on LinkedIn, and her byline says, I help medical professionals craft compelling stories. I think that says enough. Wow. Wouldn't it, if you're the head of the ethics committee, couldn't you say something more along the lines of, I help people document accurately? Wow. Right. Wow. Instead of saying you help craft compelling stories. Yeah. So, and this is the person who was considered to be the utmost authority at Lucille Packard, and her testimony towards our rights as parents.
I mean, from that individual to the individual who had a spouse who, was supportive of ventilators, to just having a very forward conversation where, was it Dr. Fox that recommended to talk to the insurance?
Yes.
Like that, just that. Also alone, you weren't going to get paid, and then all of a sudden, silence.
We're free.
And then, from the follow the money to the follow, unfortunately, which was very, very, very obviously revealed over COVID in the last 4 years, the follow the control, right? Yeah. Follow the control and follow who is in compliance and who's in like the medical tyranny. And then on top of that, it's like, whether or not you're going to get paid or not. And it is gnarly to think about all the things that you guys have had to go through, and to think about, me, in your role as a parent, but then also just to think about your daughter, and to think about like her, and then being a mental health professional like you are, like knowing the the real and potential fallout that just echoes, and it's a crazy thing to think about. And I think about that for my kid alone, just living through COVID, and being 4 years old, and being able to like today, she'll just like, we're just at Crate and Barrel outlet, and she's like, it's a mask. Like she'll just say it like straight away, and she'll say it to people walking by, because she still doesn't truly like reconcile like the understanding of what the world became, and then throw on top of that everything that you guys have been through.
And something that's really interesting, since we just have a little bit of time for it, I do think that it's fascinating to me that like the medical, it's kind of the inversion or subversion piece of it, is that the medical these medical industrial complexes, they use terms that sound a certain way, right? Like, so trauma informed care is thrown around ever since I was there, but since I worked there, but that's a big part of it, right? Trauma informed care. Now there are these two incidents that are the opposite of trauma informed care. One example is that when they were going to remove the PICC line, originally they didn't want to give Autumn anything, which, they finally don't want to give her a sedative, fine. But, if she's going to lose her mind to the point where it's unsafe, could we at least try? And I know that she doesn't respond that well to them, but could we try? And the doctor tells me that, what we recommend typically for parents is that they skedaddle, they get out of the room, and you let us do what we need to do, and then you can come in and rescue her. And I was like, so you're telling me to abandon her and then to pretend that I protected her.
Wow.
Which is mind blowing, right? And the other one is that at one point they have like the occupational therapy. When we left the hospital, Autumn could not walk. She had lost so much weight from not eating for so long. So she couldn't walk. She'd been in a hospital bed for so long too. She didn't have a voice because of because of the intubation, the prolonged intubation. Sorry, give me a second.
Okay.
I forgot exactly where I was going.
She couldn't walk.
Oh yes, she couldn't walk. So, sorry, just get overwhelmed with emotion sometimes.
I know.
So it's hard to revisit all of it. But they have these people, the occupational therapists, the physical therapists, they all come in the room and they have the hazmat suits on, which they wear because of the E. coli, supposedly. But they have to wear it for a certain amount of time. Now, she hasn't had E. coli. They also never treated E. coli. They never treated her E. coli. They told me from the beginning, that just has to work its way through her system. So the fact that we're even in all of this, right? When I thought she had intussusception. Anyway, they're wearing the hazmat suits, and they're telling me she is such a good little girl. She's, whenever we ask if we can do something, she nods her head yes. And I said, I was done at that point, right? And I said, the reason she nods her head yes is because you either hold her down, you restrain her and do it anyway, or you drug her and you do it anyway. Do you think that she thinks that she can say no? Right? And then they have these huge hazmat suits on. You look like an alien. You're terrifying. And you're asking her to play catch with you. Like, it's ridiculous, Like, you don't think this is traumatic? This is trauma-informed care? Like, that you think that this girl who says, yes all the time, she's such a good girl. What a good girl. Like, it's so gross to me, right? That they would use these terms, and that there's all of this inversion to them, right? That they truly don't understand trauma. And again, that just brings me back as a therapist to, why they're attracted to these environments in the first place, the type of people that would wake up every day and come do this. And I know there's plenty that, maybe they don't love it, maybe they can see through it, but there are a lot who don't.
Trauma is okay, acceptable if it's part of the quote standard of care and
Right.
or if it's quote medically necessary through their student derived eyes that
Right.
when your own expert goes and evaluates like I can't imagine what has been going through your mind and through your heart and how this has just been such an imprint on you. And I applaud you for sharing this story because I know for a fact that it's been on the forefront of my mind for a long time. It's how I know Gail actually is like a lot of the work that we're doing, kind of like on the back end legal side and just understanding how the infrastructure of tyranny is actually just not just normalized. It's literally the matrix that most people don't even know
Well,
exists.
it's interesting, and I don't know all of these things about like common law stuff,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
it was interesting to me that someone that we spoke with shared, because remember I was reaching out to anyone and everyone,
Of course.
and someone with me shared that you can actually look up our CPS hearing on the stock market. He was like, if I went to Fidelity right now, I can look up your what is it, like SIP number or
QSIP.
It's some sort of
it's a QSIP number.
Yes, he said I can look up your QSIP number, and there is a like bond or a certain amount of money tied to that, and that's an investment with like the government, and it was just it's so much bigger than people realize.
It is, and I will say that that's probably a couple chapters beyond where we are in this conversation. However, most people don't know that like a $40 traffic ticket is actually traded on this, market for like millions, not even like 10 times more. It's like millions of dollars. And the way that commerce, because it's all commerce, the way commerce operates, because going to the doctor and you can say, hey, no one's paying for this, and commerce stops, right? Because no one is paying for it. But on the back end, there is a whole host of money being made just by
trafficking.
It is literally a form of trafficking. And so I will say that the bravery that you share, the bravery that you exemplify and embody by sharing Autumn's story is something that came into the back of my mind somewhere in 2020, where I started to see, the mass exodus out of California, not just because of politics, not just because of Newsom, not just because of a lot of, what I've said is like the greatest producer of medical refugees is actually California. But the reality is there are people who are in our camp, the people that are influencers that have moved to other states. And when I have been very real with them in their conversation, on the forefront of their mind was that if they were in some states like ours to go to the hospital and be put in tough situations, like your child falls, and has a wound and needs a tetanus shot, something like that, right? Like that whether it's diarrhea, whether it's nutrition, whether it's cancer therapies, that your rights as a parent are at risk actually everywhere. Every state has different forms of CPS.
I really want to just drive that home because it is amazing how many people will mention like, why'd you stay in California? Which that has a lot to do with, how much law enforcement makes in other states and staying home with my children and lots of different factors, right? That's maybe not a part of our 10-year plan, but right now we're in California. But the majority of people I actually connected with who were also fellow victims of medical kidnapping, either for an elderly parent or for a child, were not actually in liberal states, or they were in maybe one that swung liberal in the Midwest or something like that. I spoke with parents whose children had either died from medical kidnapping, which is terrifying when you're in it,
I can imagine,
or whose children were removed from their care. And almost all of them were in states where I was surprised. And I remember when, a couple of different things is like, I remember people saying, well, why don't you transfer to a different hospital? And I asked like almost everyone that I spoke with in medical advocacy, is there a different hospital that you would recommend I transfer to? And they were like, not necessarily, right? Like, now it's hard to move a child across state lines when she's ventilated, like that's, maybe not an option. And then the second one is also just that almost everywhere in the country, children's hospitals are teaching hospitals, that they are practicing on your children.
Yep.
So one example was right by us, which is still in California, is people would be like, well, transfer to UCSF Benioff. And I was like, UCSF Benioff is a children's teaching hospital. UCSF, like teaching hospital, right? But this is nationwide, that children are being practiced on, that you learn on these children, and then you go off and maybe don't work with children necessarily, but that this is where a lot of teaching actually occurs. And that is not strictly in California. And so you want to inform yourself. I had someone who visited us in the hospital who said that she once had to come to Lucille Packard with her daughter very briefly. And she didn't know why there were 7 or 8 doctors in the room at the time. She had no idea. She was like, you're right. That doesn't happen at the local emergency room. I didn't know they were students. No one told me that. So that's something to inform yourself of when you are entering these environments, is where are we going to go? And that doesn't really matter what state you're in, is really
I appreciate you sharing that.
Yeah, having that knowledge. So I just want parents to know that before they're walking into these places, that it's as bad as California is, that most of the connections I made weren't just California, It's pretty,
I appreciate you sharing that, because it's a big reason why there's been so much of an emphasis for me to stay, and our family to stay, not because on the surface it's a red and blue. On the back end, there is a tyrannical measure that is an agenda that's virtually every state and every country in the world today. And so, I unfortunately have to go. My daughter's, I don't know if you could hear her, but she's pretty upset. I'm going to get going. I will reach out again, because we'll definitely have another conversation, because I believe it's such a big, big, big conversation.
It's huge. Yeah. I could get into lots of other elements. So
yeah.
I'll let you go.
We'll record. Okay. All right.
Okay. Thanks so much. Bye.
As you probably know, I'm the clinic director of the Future Generations Clinic of Chiropractic. I wanted to invite those of you in the greater San Diego area to come check us out. We expect and experience miracles in our office every day, and would love for you to experience the same, as well as your family, especially your kids. This month, we're offering our new patient package for just $67 for podcast listeners. The offer retails at $349 and includes an in-depth consultation where our patients literally tell us we know more about their family's health in the first 15 minutes than virtually every doctor on their healthcare team combined. Our state-of-the-art clinical workup, including Insight nervous system scans, full spine digital x-rays, and a functional exam. We also include a full report of your results, a customized plan to realize your greatest health potential, as well as your first adjustment in our office. Check out the link in the show notes for all the details and claim the offer. Love and appreciate you all.